A single drop of water. That's all it took to shatter the hushed elegance of San Francisco's most exclusive restaurant. For billionaire tech mogul Harrison Davenport, it was an unforgivable offense. He unleashed a torrent of rage upon a young black waitress, seeking to humiliate her, to break her, to remind her of her place. The entire room held its breath, watching the brutal display of power. But they weren't prepared for what happened next. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She looked him dead in the eye and said one sentence. A quiet five-word question from a past he thought he had buried forever. In that instant, the billionaire's world didn't just stop, it began to crumble. The air in Aurelia, perched atop a skyscraper overlooking the glittering expanse of San Francisco Bay, was so refined it felt manufactured. It was a place where conversations were conducted in hushed, confident tones, and the clinking of Christophilus silverware against Bernardo porcelain was the loudest sound one was likely to hear. Wealth wasn't just displayed here. It was inhaled, absorbed into the very fabric of the plush, velvet chairs and the dark, polished mahogany walls. On this particular Thursday evening, the restaurant's gravitational center was a corner table occupied by Harrison Davenport. Harrison wasn't merely rich, he was a force of nature. As the founder and CEO of Omnigen Dynamics, a tech behemoth that had its tendrils in everything from predictive analytics to satellite communications, he shaped markets with a single memo. His face, a sharp collection of angles and piercing blue eyes, was a regular feature on the covers of Forbes and Wired. Tonight, he was holding court. Opposite him sat Brittany, a model and influencer whose age was barely half his own, her laughter tinkling like carefully arranged wind chimes. Flanking them were two junior executives from Omnigen, both men in their late 20s, their gazes fixed on Harrison with a mixture of reverence and terror. Their waitress for the evening was Serafina Jones. At 24, Serafina, or Sarah as she preferred, moved with a quiet efficiency that belied the exhaustion settling deep in her bones. For her, Aurelia wasn't a sanctuary of the elite. It was a battlefield. It was 4 12-hour shifts a week that paid for her tiny apartment in Oakland, and more importantly, the tuition for her night classes at the University of San Francisco School of Law. Every condescending glance, every impatient snap of the fingers was a transaction, in exchange for a future where she would no longer have to serve men like Harrison Davenport. She was aware of who he was, of course. It was impossible not to be. His company's logo was plastered on the side of the very building she was in. She had even read about his supposedly humble beginnings, a narrative the media loved to spin, the scrappy orphan who clawed his way out of poverty through sheer genius and will. To Sarah, it was just a story. In her experience, men who amassed that much power rarely did so without leaving a trail of wreckage behind them. The evening began with a series of minor tremors that signaled the impending earthquake. The Pouilly Fuissé is adequate, Harrison declared after a delicate sniff and a cursory sip, his pronouncement hanging in the air like a death sentence for the wine. But one expects more than adequate at these prices. Don't you agree? He didn't look at Sarah, but at his executives, who nodded in frantic agreement. Sarah simply inclined her head. I can bring the wine list again, sir, if you'd like to select something else. No, he waved a dismissive hand, the platinum band of his Patek Philippe watch catching the light. It will suffice, for now. Next it was the temperature of the butter, then the ambient lighting, which he claimed was casting an unflattering shadow on Brittany. Each complaint was a small assertion of dominance, a test of the world's willingness to bend to his whim, and the world, as represented by the restaurant's flustered manager, Mr. Dubois, bent with practiced ease. Dubois scurried over, apologizing profusely, adjusting the invisible thermostat, and offering complimentary amuse-bouches, his face a mask of strained servility. Sarah, however, refused to break. She maintained a shield of impenetrable professionalism. Her voice was even, her movements deliberate, her expression neutral. She had learned long ago that her composure was her armor. To show emotion, whether frustration or fear, was to give them a victory they hadn't earned. She refilled their water glasses, cleared their plates, and recited the dessert specials with the placid calm of a seasoned professional. It was during the final water refill that the single drop fell. She was leaning over the table, pitcher in hand, reaching for one of the executive's glasses. Harrison shifted unexpectedly in his seat, gesturing expansively while telling a story. Her elbow was jostled, a minuscule, barely perceptible tremor. A single perfect bead of chilled water escaped the pitcher's spout, arced through the air, and landed with a faint tick on the screen of Harrison Davenport's obsidian black smartphone, which lay beside his plate like a sacred tablet. The silence was instantaneous and absolute. The executives froze, forks halfway to their mouths. Brittany's tinkling laughter died in her throat. Mr. Dubois, who had been hovering nearby, looked as if he'd just witnessed a murder. Harrison Davenport slowly, deliberately, lowered his gaze from Sarah's face to the phone. He stared at the single drop of water as if it were a mortal wound. He lifted his eyes again, and the mask of civilized charm was gone. What looked back at Sarah was something cold, something reptilian. "Are you incompetent?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Sarah drew a breath. "My apologies, sir. It was an accident." She reached for a fresh napkin to wipe the screen. "Don't touch it," he hissed, snatching the phone away. He held it up for his audience to see, the single drop of water now a symbol of gross negligence. "This is a $1,200 device. This is my connection to a multi-billion-dollar global enterprise. And you," he spat the word, "you just slop water on it like you're swilling a pig trough." The cruelty of the words, so disproportionate to the offense, hung in the air. The other diners at nearby tables began to turn, their curiosity piqued by the shift in tone. Sarah stood her ground, her back straight. "It was a single drop of water, sir. The phone is waterproof. It was my mistake, and I apologize." Her refusal to grovel seemed to enrage him further. He stood up, his tall frame casting a shadow over her. Now he was no longer speaking. He was projecting, his voice rising in volume and venom. "Your mistake? Your mistake is thinking you belong in a place like this at all. People like you. You don't appreciate what it takes. The discipline, the intelligence, the breeding. You're here to perform a simple function, to carry a plate, to pour water, and you can't even do that right." He was looking directly at her, but his words were for the room, for the executives, for Brittany, for everyone. It was a performance, a demonstration of his power to humiliate. The racial undertone was unspoken but vibrated in every syllable of "people like you." Mr. Dubois rushed forward. "Mr. Davenport, please. I am so terribly sorry. It will not happen again. The entire meal is on the house, of course. Everything." Harrison ignored him, his eyes still locked on Sarah. He saw her as an object, a symbol of the service class he had long ago transcended. He wanted to see her crack. He wanted tears. He wanted her to beg for forgiveness for her job. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he finally roared, the crescendo of his tirade. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper meant only for her, but loud enough for the table to hear. "I could buy this building and have it torn down just for the inconvenience. Your life is a rounding error on my balance sheet. You exist to serve people like me." He was done. He had delivered his final, crushing blow. He straightened up, a smug, satisfied look on his face, expecting to see a broken woman. The entire restaurant was frozen. The silence was thick with discomfort and shock. Sarah didn't move. She didn't look down. She didn't cry. The shield of professionalism was gone, but it wasn't replaced by fear. It was replaced by something else entirely, a profound, ancient calm. She lifted her chin, and her eyes, dark and clear, met his. When she spoke, her voice was not the waitress's deferential tone. It was quiet, steady, and carried the weight of a shared, forgotten history. It sliced through the tension-filled air with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. She asked a simple, 5-word question. "Harry, have you forgotten me?" The name hung in the air. Harry, it was not Mr. Davenport. It was not the name of a demigod who moved markets and graced magazine covers. It was the name of a boy, a ghost from a life Harrison Davenport had spent 2 decades and billions of dollars trying to incinerate. For a moment, the world truly did stop. Harrison's face, which had been a mask of triumphant cruelty, seemed to shatter. The smugness vanished, replaced by a flicker of raw, unadulterated shock. His piercing blue eyes, which had been so full of fire, now looked like frozen lakes, a deep and sudden panic swirling beneath the surface. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The carefully constructed persona of Harrison Davenport, the titan of industry, dissolved, and for a split second, the room saw a different man, a startled, cornered animal. Brittany was the first to break the spell. "Harry?" she asked, her voice laced with confusion. "Who is she calling Harry?" The executives exchanged bewildered glances. Mr. Dubois looked back and forth between the billionaire and the waitress, his mind unable to compute this impossible turn of events. Sarah didn't break eye contact. She had fired her shot, and now she watched it land. She saw the recognition dawn in his eyes, followed swiftly by a wave of pure, primal fear. He knew exactly who she was. I don't know what you're talking about," Harrison finally managed to stammer, his voice a hoarse whisper, a pathetic echo of its earlier roar. He was trying to rebuild his crumbling fortress, but the foundations were shaken. "You're fired. Get out of my sight." "Was it worth it?" Sarah asked, her voice still quiet, yet it carried across the silent room. It was not a question of malice, but one of genuine, sorrowful curiosity. "Everything you took. Was it worth it, Harry?" Each word was a hammer blow against his composure. "Took? I took nothing," he snarled, trying to reclaim his anger. But it was hollow now, brittle. He was no longer the aggressor. He was on the defensive. He fumbled in his pocket, pulled out a thick wad of cash, and threw it onto the table. It wasn't a payment. It was a desperate attempt to end the confrontation, to buy his escape. "Let's go!" he snapped at Brittany, grabbing her by the arm. He didn't wait for his executives. He practically fled the restaurant, pushing past the stunned hostess at the entrance and disappearing into the private elevator. The silence he left behind was heavier than before. Everyone stared at Sarah, this enigmatic waitress who had just brought a billionaire to his knees with a single name. The pile of $100 bills sat on the table, looking obscene and out of place. Mr. Dubois finally found his voice, a frantic, squeaking thing. "What did you do?" he hissed, his face pale. "What in God's name did you just do?" "I told the truth," Sarah said calmly. "You're fired," Dubois almost shrieked, pointing a trembling finger toward the staff exit. "You are fired. Don't even think about clocking out. Just get your things and go. I never want to see your face in here again." He was terrified, trying to perform damage control for a disaster he couldn't even comprehend, hoping his swift action would somehow appease the ghost of his most powerful client. Sarah didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply nodded once, turned without a glance at the money on the table, and walked toward the swinging doors of the kitchen. Her colleagues, the other waiters and chefs who had witnessed the scene from the periphery, parted for her like she was royalty. They looked at her with a mixture of awe and fear. She had done what none of them had ever dared to dream of. She had fought back. She retrieved her worn backpack from her locker, a thick constitutional law textbook sticking out of the top. As she pushed open the back alley door, the cool, damp San Francisco fog felt like a balm on her skin. The adrenaline that had sustained her began to fade, leaving a deep, weary ache in its place. She hadn't planned for this. For years, she had imagined what she might say to him if she ever saw him again. But she never thought it would actually happen. And she certainly never thought it would happen here, in the middle of her shift. Miss Jones?" A voice cut through the fog. She turned to see a man hurrying out of the same alley door. He was in his late 30s with a slightly disheveled look, kind eyes, and a reporter's notebook in his hand. He had been dining alone at a small table, not 10 feet from Davenport's. "My name is Finian O'Connell," he said, offering a hand. "I'm an investigative journalist with the San Francisco Chronicle. I saw what happened in there, and I have a feeling there's a much bigger story than a rude customer." Sarah looked at his outstretched hand, then into his eyes. She saw not just professional curiosity, but genuine concern. For years, she had carried this story alone, a weight that threatened to crush her. Now, for the first time, someone was offering to help bear the load. "It's a long story," she said, her voice wavering for the first time that night. "I've got time," Finian replied, his gaze steady, and I've got a feeling it's a story that needs to be told. He gestured down the alley toward a small 24-hour diner, its neon sign cutting a warm, inviting glow through the mist. Can I buy you a coffee? I think you've earned it. Sarah looked from the diner back to the gleaming skyscraper that housed Aurelia, the gilded cage she had just escaped. She had lost her job, but in that restaurant she had found her voice. And maybe, just maybe, she had found an ally. She gave a small, tired smile and nodded. Okay, Mr. O'Connell. I'd like that. It was time to tell him about Harry. It was time to tell him about the fire. It was time to tell him about the promise they made to a man named Elias Thornton. The diner was a world away from Aurelia. The air smelled of burnt coffee and frying bacon. The vinyl on the booth seats was cracked, and the lighting was a harsh, unforgiving fluorescent. It was real. For Sarah, it felt like coming home. Finian O'Connell slid into the booth opposite her, his reporter's notebook already open. He didn't press her, just waited patiently as she wrapped her cold hands around the warm, thick ceramic of her coffee mug. You called him Harry, Finian started gently. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. Sarah took a long sip of coffee. In a way he did, she said, her gaze distant, looking past Finian and into a time nearly 20 years ago. The person he is now, Harrison Davenport, the billionaire. That's a character he created. The person I knew was Harry Davenport, a smart, hungry kid from the foster system in East Oakland, who was just as poor and just as lost as I was. Finian's pen began to move. How did you know each other? We grew up in the same system, bounced around the same group homes, she explained, but we really connected at Thornton's. It was our sanctuary. Thornton's? A genuine, warm smile touched Sarah's lips for the first time. Elias Thornton's community workshop. It wasn't much to look at, just a dusty old garage filled with broken computers, discarded electronics, and the smell of solder. Elias was this brilliant, kind old man, a retired electrical engineer from Berkeley who believed that talent was everywhere, but opportunity wasn't. So he created his own. He took in kids like us, street kids, foster kids, anyone who was interested, and he taught us. He taught us how to code, how to build circuits, how to repair anything. He gave us a purpose. She painted a vivid picture for Finian, a sun-drenched, dusty garage where a lanky, intense teenager named Harry, with fire in his eyes and a genius for seeing patterns in chaos, would work for hours on a circuit board. She described a younger version of herself, a quiet, observant girl who found solace in the logic of code, a world that made sense when nothing else did. And at the center of it all was Elias Thornton, a man with a wild mane of white hair, ink-stained fingers, and a belief that technology should be a tool for liberation, not control. Harry was the star, Sarah admitted, without a trace of jealousy. He was a prodigy. Elias saw it from day one. He saw this raw, untamed intellect, and he nurtured it. He treated us both like his own kids. We weren't just students. We were a family. Harry was like the big brother I never had. We were a team. What was he like back then? The boy, Harry. Sarah's expression became more complex, tinged with a deep sadness. He was ambitious, desperate even. He hated being poor. He hated the system that had chewed him up and spit him out. He used to talk for hours about how one day he'd be on top, how he'd never be powerless again. I thought he meant he wanted to build things, to create a better world. Elias taught us that was the point of it all, to use our skills to lift up our community, not just ourselves. Her eyes darkened. That's where the promise came in. The promise you mentioned in the restaurant, Finian prompted. Yes, Elias, for all his genius, wasn't a businessman. He was a creator. For years, he'd been working on a side project, something he called Midas. It was a data compression algorithm unlike anything that existed. It could shrink massive data files down to almost nothing with zero loss of quality. It was revolutionary. He knew it was his masterpiece, the thing that could change the world, and finally provide real funding for dozens of community workshops like his. She leaned forward, her voice dropping. The week before the fire, he finally perfected it. I was there. So was Harry. We were in the workshop late at night, watching him run the final simulation. It worked perfectly. He was ecstatic. He printed out the source code and his research notes, this thick stack of papers, and he put it in his old metal fire safe. He looked at me and Harry, and he was almost in tears. He made us promise. Promise me, he said, that whatever you do with the gifts you have, you will always remember where you came from. That you will use your power to help people, not to hoard it. We both promised. Harry was the most emotional I'd ever seen him. He swore on his life. Sarah paused, taking a shaky breath. The memory was still raw, a wound that had never properly healed. 1 week later, the workshop burned to the ground, she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. Elias was inside. The official report said it was an electrical fire. Faulty wiring in an old building. Case closed. Finian's pen stopped moving. He looked at her, the pieces clicking into place in his mind. And the fire safe? The research? Gone, Sarah whispered. The report said the fire was so intense it had warped the safe and incinerated the contents. I was 16. I was devastated, placed in a new group home across the bay. I tried to find Harry after the funeral. He was just gone, disappeared. No one knew where he went. It was like he'd vanished off the face of the earth. She looked down at her hands, clenching them into fists on the tabletop. About 18 months later, a new tech startup called OmniGen Dynamics appeared in Silicon Valley, seemingly out of nowhere. It was founded by a mysterious, brilliant young man named Harrison Davenport. Their flagship product, the one that got them all their seed funding from venture capitalists, was a revolutionary new data compression algorithm they called Ethelred Core. It made them billions. The silence in the diner was broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. You think he stole it, Finian said. It wasn't a question. I think, Sarah said, finally looking up, her eyes burning with a conviction that had simmered for 2 decades, that there was no faulty wiring. I think Harry Davenport set that fire, killed the only man who ever cared about him, and stole his life's work. He built his empire on the ashes of our home and on the back of a broken promise. Finian leaned back in the booth, letting out a slow breath. This was it. This was the story, a tale of genius, betrayal, and murder, hidden behind the gleaming facade of a tech empire. It was David versus Goliath, but David had a story that could shatter Goliath's world. He covered his tracks well, Finian mused, changed his name, built a new identity, but he didn't count on one thing. What's that? Sarah asked. He didn't count on you getting a job as a waitress in the same restaurant he likes to eat in, 20 years later. A grim irony twisted Sarah's lips. I've been in law school for 2 years, Mr. O'Connell. I've been studying evidence, procedure, the burden of proof. I know my suspicions aren't enough. It's my word against the billionaires. Who do you think the world will believe? Finian O'Connell picked up his pen and clicked it. A determined glint entered his eye. They'll believe us, he said, because we're not just going to tell them a story. We're going to find the proof. The morning after the confrontation at Aurelia, the world began to move at a dizzying speed. Harrison Davenport's world, built on pristine code and ruthless efficiency, was suddenly besieged by the messy, unpredictable chaos of his past. Inside his sterile, white-walled penthouse that seemed to float above the clouds, Harrison was pacing like a caged wolf. The cool, collected titan of industry was gone, replaced by the frantic, terrified Harry from Oakland. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, Seraphina's face, calm, knowing, and utterly damning. What do we know? He barked into his phone. On the other end was Arthur Chen, the head of his personal legal and security team, a man paid an astronomical salary to make problems disappear. Harrison, calm down, Arthur's voice was a steadying baritone. We know her name is Seraphina Jones, age 24, lives in Oakland, part-time waitress, full-time law student at USF, no criminal record. So far, she seems to be a nobody. She is not a nobody, Harrison roared, slamming his fist on a marble countertop. She was there. She knows about Elias. She knows everything. She knows a story, Harrison, a memory from when she was a child. There is no proof of anything, Arthur said soothingly. We need to control the narrative. The first step is containment. Containment began less than 12 hours after Sarah had coffee with Finian. A sleek, black town car pulled up outside her modest apartment building. A man in a perfectly tailored suit, smelling of expensive cologne and quiet menace, hand-delivered a thick envelope. Inside was not a threat, but an offer. It was a non-disclosure agreement of breathtaking scope. It forbade her from ever speaking, writing, or even hinting about Harrison Davenport, Harry Davenport, Elias Thornton, or a list of related terms. In exchange for her eternal silence, she would be paid $5 million. The final pages detailed the penalties for breaking the agreement. Lawsuits so vast they would bankrupt her and her descendants for generations. Sarah read the document at her small kitchen table, the legal jargon both familiar from her studies and sickening in its intent. It was an attempt to purchase her history, to legally erase her truth. She slid the papers into her backpack without a second thought. It wasn't an offer, it was a confession. The second wave of the attack was aimed at Finian O'Connell. He arrived at the Chronicle newsroom to a summons from his editor-in-chief, a man named Bob Peterson. Bob looked grim. "Finn, I got a call this morning," he said, closing his office door, "from the General Counsel of Omnigen Dynamics. A courtesy call to let me know that any stories published containing defamatory and baseless allegations against Mr. Davenport would be met with the full, unrestrained legal force of their corporation." "It's not baseless, Bob," Finian insisted. "This is real. The story she tells—" "I believe you," Bob said, holding up a hand. "But they also called our publisher. They reminded him how much advertising revenue Omnigen and its subsidiaries buy in this paper every year. They're trying to choke us out before we even start. The publisher is spooked. He said we can't run with this unless we have something more than the word of a disgruntled, recently fired waitress." "She's not disgruntled. She's a witness." "Then find me proof, Finn." Bob's voice was strained. "Find me something solid. A document. Another witness. Anything. Until then, my hands are tied. Officially, you're off the story." He paused, then looked at his star reporter. "Unofficially, you've got a week of paid leave coming to you. What you do with your time is your own business. Just don't use a company computer." It was a risk for Bob, a quiet act of defiance. Finian understood. He was on his own. He met Sarah at a public library, the one place they felt safe from prying eyes and listening devices. He told her about the pressure on his paper. She showed him the NDA. "He's scared," Sarah said, a note of grim satisfaction in her voice. "If the story wasn't true, he'd ignore it. This much pressure means we're right. But it also means we're fighting an enemy with unlimited resources," Finian countered. "We need more than just your testimony, the fire report. You said it was ruled an accident." "It was," Sarah confirmed. "I got a copy of it years ago when I first started thinking about law school. It was thin, cursory." "Let's start there," Finian said, his journalistic instincts kicking in. "Official reports are written by people, and people can be lazy, they can be pressured, or they can make mistakes. Who was the lead fire investigator on the scene?" They spent the next 4 hours digging through online city archives. Finally, they found it. The original incident report for the blaze at Elias Thornton's workshop. The lead investigator was a Captain Robert Morley of the Oakland Fire Department. A quick search revealed he had retired 7 years ago and was now living in a small town up in Napa Valley. "It's a long shot," Finian said, looking at the address on the screen. "He might not remember a thing. It was 20 years ago." "We have to try," Sarah insisted. "It's the only thread we have." The next day, they drove Finian's beat-up sedan up to Napa. They found Robert Morley in his garden, a weathered man in his late 60s with kind, tired eyes tending to his tomato plants. He was hesitant at first, wary of a reporter and a young woman digging up a past he'd long since put to rest. "I remember that fire," he said slowly, wiping dirt from his hands onto his jeans. "Old workshop down on 3rd Street. Sad business. The old man who ran it, he was a fixture in that neighborhood, a real loss." "The report said it was electrical," Finian stated. Morley paused, his gaze drifting off toward the distant hills. He was silent for a long moment. "The official report said that," he finally corrected. "That's what the brass decided to go with. Easiest explanation." Sarah's heart began to beat faster. "You didn't agree?" Morley sighed, a heavy, weary sound. "Look, I'm retired. I don't want any trouble." "Mr. Morley," Sarah pleaded, her voice earnest, The man who died, Elias Thornton, he was like a father to me. The boy who was with me, who disappeared, is Harrison Davenport. We believe he stole Mr. Thornton's work and that the fire wasn't an accident. We just want the truth." The mention of Harrison Davenport's name made Morley's eyes widen slightly. He looked at Sarah's face, at her desperate sincerity, and something in him softened. "Off the record?" he asked Finian. "For now, yes. Off the record," Finian agreed. "The burn patterns were all wrong for an electrical fire," Morley said, his voice low, as if sharing a long-buried secret. "It burned too hot, too fast. I remember the smell. There was a chemical scent, like an accelerant. But my initial findings were discouraged. I was told it was a tragic accident in an under-resourced neighborhood and to file the report accordingly. That a full arson investigation would be a waste of departmental resources." "Discouraged by who?" Finian pressed. "I don't know for sure. The pressure came from downtown. It was subtle, but it was there. Just wrap it up and move on." He shook his head. "It always bothered me. It felt incomplete." It was the first real crack in the official story. A former fire captain confirming the investigation was a sham. "Is there anything else you remember?" Sarah asked. "Anyone else who was there? Anyone who asked questions?" Morley thought for a moment, rubbing his chin. "You know, there was someone. A few weeks after the fire, some guy came sniffing around, asking questions. Not a cop. Claimed to be a friend of Thornton's. A nerdy fellow. Glasses, seemed really spooked. Said he used to work with Elias sometimes. Name was Jeffrey something. I told him what little I could, and he just disappeared. Never saw him again." Jeffrey. A new name. A new thread. As they drove back to the Bay Area, the mood in the car was electric. They had a new lead. Harrison Davenport hadn't just covered his tracks with the fire department, he'd also scared off a potential witness. But as they crossed the Bay Bridge, back toward Oakland, Sarah's phone rang. It was an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered, putting it on speaker. "Serafina Jones," a cold, familiar voice said. It was Arthur Chen, Harrison's legal fixer. "I'm advising you one last time," he said, dispensing with any pleasantries. "Accept the offer. Stop talking to reporters. Stop digging into things that don't concern you. Mr. Davenport is a powerful man. He values his privacy. If you persist, the consequences will be severe. We will not just sue you for libel. We will investigate every aspect of your life, your academic records, your financial aid, your past. We will find something, and we will use it to ruin you. Do you understand?" The threat was naked, brutal. Sarah looked at Finian, whose face was set in a hard line. This was the Empire striking back, not with offers of money, but with the promise of destruction. Sarah held the phone, her hand steady. She thought of Elias, of his kindness and his dream. She thought of the scared boy, Harry, who had become this monster. She thought of the promise they had both made. "I understand perfectly," Sarah said into the phone, her voice as cold and clear as ice. "And I'm not stopping." She ended the call. The gauntlet had been thrown. It was no longer just about uncovering the past. It was a war for the future. And they had just found their next soldier's name, Jeffrey. Now they had to find the man himself. The search for Jeffrey became an obsession for Sarah and Finian. It was their only hope of finding a living witness, someone who could corroborate the story beyond a retired fire captain's off-the-record suspicions. But Jeffrey was a ghost. 20 years had passed. He wasn't in any public records connected to Elias Thornton, and the last name Morley had forgotten was a critical missing piece. Meanwhile, Arthur Chen's threat proved to be more than just words. A formal inquiry was launched by the university into Sarah's financial aid application, citing an anonymous tip-off about potential discrepancies. Her landlord suddenly began threatening eviction over a minor noise complaint from months ago. Finian found himself being tailed by a nondescript sedan. Harrison Davenport's machine was working to systematically dismantle their lives, to isolate them, to make them toxic to anyone who might help. They were running out of time and options. Desperate, they returned to the one place where it all began, the site of Elias Thornton's workshop in East Oakland. The original building was long gone, replaced by a generic low-rise apartment complex. There was nothing left to see. It's hopeless, Finian said, kicking at a loose piece of gravel. We're looking for a man with one name from 2 decades ago. He could be dead. He could be on the other side of the planet. Sarah wasn't listening. She was staring at the apartment building, but seeing the ghost of the garage that once stood there. She was trying to remember every detail of that last week, searching for a clue she might have missed. Elias had a system, she said, thinking aloud. He backed everything up. He was paranoid about losing his work. He had floppy disks, zip drives, external hard drives. He was always experimenting with storage. But Morley said the safe was incinerated, Finian reminded her. The primary safe, yes, Sarah said, her eyes widening. The one with the paper printouts. But Elias was a digital native. He wouldn't have trusted just paper. He always said, 1 is none, 2 is 1. He must have had a digital backup somewhere else. She paced the sidewalk, her mind racing. Jeffrey. He was nerdy, Morley said. He worked with Elias sometimes. What did he do? They spent another day at the library, but this time they weren't searching for people. They were searching for old tech forms, digital archives, and bulletins from the late 1990s and early 2000s Bay Area tech scene. Sarah typed in every keyword she could think of. Elias Thornton, data compression, Oakland workshop. And then she found it. It was a post on an obscure, long-defunct cryptography forum dated 1999. The author, with the username Geologic, was asking a highly technical question about data redundancy. In his post, he mentioned collaborating with a local genius in Oakland, ET, on a compression project. Geologic, Finian breathed. Jeffrey. Look at his profile, Sarah said, clicking the username. The profile was sparse, but it listed a full name, Jeffrey Lang, and an old defunct email address from a long-gone internet service provider. It was the key. With a full name, Finian could now use his journalistic access to proprietary databases. The search was slow, sifting through 20 years of records. They found a Jeffrey Lang who had lived in Oakland until 2004, then moved to Portland, Oregon. From there, the trail went cold for a while, until he reappeared 5 years ago in, of all places, rural Nevada. He's living completely off the grid, Finian said, looking at the satellite image of a small, isolated property outside a tiny desert town. No social media, no credit cards, pays his property taxes by mail order. This guy doesn't want to be found. He's not just hiding, Sarah realized. He's terrified. He knows what Harrison is capable of. They knew they couldn't call. They had to go. It was their last desperate gambit. Leaving a note for Bob Peterson telling him where he was going, just in case, Finian and Sarah began the long drive out to the Nevada desert. They found the property at the end of a long, dusty dirt road. It was a small, prefabricated home powered by solar panels, surrounded by a fence. As they pulled up, a thin, pale man with thick glasses and a nervous energy came out onto the porch. It was Jeffrey Lang. He looked like a man who had been expecting a visitor he never wanted to see. I know who you are, he said, his voice shaky, before they could even introduce themselves. He pointed at Sarah. You're Serafina. You've grown up. He ushered them inside. The house was crammed with old computer hardware, a testament to a life spent in the digital world. I saw his face on a magazine cover about 10 years ago, Jeffrey began, his hands trembling as he poured them glasses of water. Harrison Davenport. I knew it was Harry. I almost threw up. I packed my bags that day and moved out here. I knew he'd come for me eventually if he ever thought I was a threat. We need your help, Jeffrey, Sarah said gently. We know he set the fire. We know he stole Midas. Jeffrey shook his head, his fear palpable. You don't understand. He's not just a billionaire. He's a monster. He killed Elias. He would have killed me too if I'd said anything. But what can you prove? Finian asked, getting to the point. Jeffrey looked from Finian to Sarah, a conflicted agony on his face. He seemed to be weighing 20 years of fear against a flicker of long-dormant courage. Finally, he seemed to make a decision. He stood up and walked over to a dusty beige computer tower from the late 90s, sitting in a corner like a museum piece. Elias was brilliant, but he was also forgetful. He was always losing things. The day before the fire, he asked me to make a full, ghost image backup of his primary workstation, just in case the main drive failed. He was going to put the backup drive in a different safe deposit box, but he never got the chance. Jeffrey opened the side panel of the old computer. After the fire, when Harry disappeared, I got scared. I came by the wreckage, pretending to be a friend. I knew where Elias kept his secondary stash of hardware, hidden under a loose floorboard in the back office. The fire hadn't reached that corner. It was mostly water damage. I took one thing, the backup drive. He reached inside the ancient computer case and pulled out an old, heavy 3.5-inch hard drive. He held it out in his trembling hands. It felt like a sacred relic. I didn't know what to do with it, Jeffrey confessed, his voice thick with emotion. I was too scared to go to the police. And who would believe me? But I couldn't bring myself to destroy it. It's all that's left of him, of his work. Sarah took the hard drive from him. It was heavy, real, solid. It was the proof, the ghost in the machine. The Midas algorithm is on here, Jeffrey whispered. Every line of code, every research note, with time-stamped file creation dates from a week before the fire. It's the digital DNA of Omnigen's entire fortune. Finian looked at the hard drive, then at Sarah. This is it, he said, a look of awe on his face. This is the weapon that wins the war. They had him. They had Harrison Davenport. Cold. The final confrontation was not in a restaurant or a boardroom. At Finian's insistence, and with the Chronicle's legal team now fully and aggressively behind them, they arranged a meeting. They didn't go to Harrison. They summoned him. He was subpoenaed to give a deposition in the pre-filing discovery for the lawsuit. The estate of Elias Thornton vs. Harrison Davenport and Omnigen Dynamics. Harrison arrived at the law office flanked by Arthur Chen and a team of lawyers. He was back in his armor, the cool, untouchable billionaire. He was ready to deny, deflect, and destroy. He believed it was still his word against theirs. Sarah and Finian sat opposite him at the long conference table, along with their own lawyer. This is a baseless and malicious proceeding, Arthur Chen began. My client will not be answering any questions about his fictitious past. Sarah said nothing. She simply slid a small object across the polished table. It was the old hard drive. Harrison Davenport stared at it. At first, there was no recognition. It was just an obsolete piece of technology. This is our Exhibit A, Sarah's lawyer announced. A hard drive recovered from the workshop of Elias Thornton. It contains a full date-stamped backup of his research, including the complete source code for a project he called Midas. We have had it verified by 3 independent forensic experts. The code is, line for line, a 99.7% match for the foundational Ethelred core algorithm that Omnigen was founded upon. The color drained from Harrison's face. The armor disintegrated. The confident posture collapsed. He stared at the hard drive as if it were a bomb. He looked up at Sarah, and in his eyes she saw it all. The cornered rage, the disbelief, and the dawning, horrifying certainty of his own destruction. It wasn't just about the theft anymore. The existence of this drive proved the fire was no accident. It was the key to unlocking a murder investigation. He didn't scream. He didn't rage. Harrison Davenport, the Titan, simply slumped in his chair, the fight gone from him. The ghost of Harry, the poor, hungry boy from Oakland who had made a devil's bargain, had finally come to claim his soul. The story Finian O'Connell published was more than a story. It was an earthquake. It shook Silicon Valley to its core and became a global headline. Harrison Davenport was obliterated. Omnigen's board fired him. The stock plummeted, and he was immediately arrested on charges of intellectual property theft, fraud, and, most damningly, arson and murder in the reopened case of Elias Thornton's death. Sarah never had to finish her law degree at night school. The settlement from the Thornton estate made her a wealthy woman overnight. But she didn't buy a penthouse or a fancy car. She finished her degree, passed the bar, and used the entirety of the settlement, billions of dollars, to create the Elias Thornton Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to funding and building tech and innovation centers for underprivileged youth in underserved communities across the country. She had fulfilled the promise, not just her own, but Harry's too. She had taken the power he had hoarded and given it back to the world, turning a legacy of greed and betrayal into one of hope and opportunity. In the end, the waitress didn't just get justice. She rewrote the entire story. The story of Serafina Jones and Harrison Davenport is a stark reminder that our past is never truly buried. It lives in the memories of those we've known and the choices we've made. A single, quiet voice speaking the truth can be more powerful than all the money and influence in the world. It shows us that true strength isn't about how loud you can shout, but about the conviction to stand firm in your own truth, even when you're shaking. Serafina didn't just expose a billionaire's crime. She reclaimed a legacy of hope that was stolen and, in doing so, honored the mentor who believed in her. Her victory wasn't just for herself, it was for every person who has ever been dismissed, belittled, or told they don't matter. If this story moved you, please hit the like button and share it with others. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories about justice, courage, and the hidden truths that shape our world.